I don't know about you, but sometimes I feel like I've forgotten probably more things than I remember. I was looking at just facts about forgetfulness and remembering and things like that, and everyone forgets things, right? There's a ton of things that you have forgotten that I have forgotten, and according to a Johns Hopkins researcher, here are the things that most people forget. Okay, so you probably are in these things. The number one thing, 83% of people forget names, right? You meet someone. I remember I was at in a business networking thing, and a business owner friend of mine was doing a lot of these things, and he told me, he said, "Here's the key." He said, "Repeat the name. Whenever somebody tells you their name, repeat their name back to them, and maybe try and add it a third time." Here's my trick. If you ever need a trick for names, let's say you've met someone, but you maybe have forgotten their name. Find somebody else and then introduce them. If you like somebody you know, right? So it's like if I was here with Jeff and somebody I didn't know, I'd say, "Oh, hey, this is by the way, meet Jeff." And Jeff is going to go, "Oh, hi, I'm Jeff." And the other person's going to go, "Oh, my name is," and then you go, "Got it," and then you can start rolling in there. That's a little trick of the trade, by the way. Second thing, things people forget: where something is, right? You forget where you misplace something. The third thing, telephone numbers. But think about this now. What do you know any telephone numbers besides the ones that were besides yours and your home number from 50 years ago or 30 years ago or 20 years ago, right? Phone numbers. We know our own kid's phone number, right? We know our parents' phone number, maybe your own phone number. But when's the last time somebody gave you a phone number, you remembered it? The fourth thing, words. Oh man, what was the word I was trying to think of? It's like trying to use the perfect word for this scenario, and I can't think of it. Number 5, what was said? Oh, I forgot what that person said. I forgot what they told me. I forgot that. And then number 6 is faces. People forget faces. That's not me. I actually remember faces very, very well. If I meet you, I probably will remember. I might not remember your name, but I might go, "I've met this person before. I feel like I've met this person." And if you can't remember whether you've just done something, that's 36% of the population can't remember if they've just, did I leave the garage door open? Did I turn the coffee pot off? Did I let the dog out? Did we put the dog away? Right? You leave the house. Those things, 38% of the population can't remember if they've just done something or not. So remembering, forgetting is a part of our lives. We remember things, we forget things. It's played an important part in the lives of God's people to remember things. I once read this quote. I'll throw this up here. The life of faith is one big act of remembering. A life of faith is one big act of remembering. On Memorial Day, this weekend, as we think about and remember and memorialize, right? We memorialize those who have given their lives as a sacrifice for our freedoms, for our country. I want to encourage you to also remember the Lord your God. That's the name of our sermon today. For Christians, every day should be Memorial Day for us in regards to remembering God. Every day is a day to remember what the Lord has done, his miracles, his promises that are going to be fulfilled, those that haven't been fulfilled, his provision, his sacrifice. The term remember is used 352 times in the scriptures. It's a lot of times. When its variants are counted, when the different variations of the term remember, it's up to more than 550 or so. That's a lot of remembering. Remember, remember, remember. In the Bible, you read kind of two aspects of remembering. And the first part that we'll just kind of go over briefly is that God remembers us. Now, it doesn't mean that he forgets us, right? God doesn't forget. But there are times in the Bible where we read that it says God remembers his people in a special way. In Genesis 9, with Noah and the flood, and when the rainbow was put in the sky, Moses tells us about this act, and he says that when God sees the rainbow, he will remember his covenant with his people. When God sees the rainbow. In Exodus 2, right before Right before Moses is going to, God is going to raise up Moses, the people of God, the Hebrew people, they're enslaved. They've been enslaved for hundreds of years, and they've been crying out to God, and it says, God heard their cries, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. Okay? So God, there are certain times where it says God remembers and then he acts on something. That's kind of what that means. Again, it doesn't mean that he forgot, but his covenant, whatever thing he's remembering, the scripture is saying he remembering is about to cause him to act, to do something. But there are also numerous encouragements and commands for God's people to remember him. For God's people to remember the Lord. And that's what we're going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at one passage today in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 8, is where we're going to be. So you can turn there if you want. These words, they were spoken by Moses, and they were addressed to the second generation of the people of Israel after they had been delivered from Pharaoh and the land of Egypt. Okay? So the second generation. So for 40 years after the Exodus, after you have the Pharaoh, probably know that story, all the plagues, and they get delivered. 40 years they wander the wilderness. And the first generation, that generation of people, they failed to enter the promised land. They actually were going to make it in there, but because they didn't believe God, because they were disobedient, he said, I'm going to make you wander 40 years, and this generation is going to die off, and it's going to be the second generation that is going to take the land. So that's what's happening here. The first generation has died. The second generation is about to enter and take possession of the land that God had promised the people. And the book of Deuteronomy contains God's words of encouragement to that generation before they're entering the land. Okay, so there's a lot of instruction happening here. So we're going to take a little walk through this passage. We're going to go through the whole chapter 8, and we're going to see how they were commanded to remember, the different aspects of remembering, and then how we can also take part in those things. Okay, so Deuteronomy chapter 8, it'll be up on the screen, and there are a few verses that will be highlighted, so just take note of those things. If you want to mark those down, those are kind of the key verses. So he says, this is Moses talking to the people, the whole commandment, for God speaking through Moses to the people. The whole commandment that I command you today, you shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land that the Lord swore to give to your fathers. And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And he did humble you. He humbled you, and he let you hunger, and he fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothing did not wear out on you, and your foot did not swell these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, the Lord your God disciplines you. So you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God by walking in his ways and fearing him. The first thing we must remember is God's guidance. God's guidance. He tells them at the very beginning, he says, you have to be careful. He says, be careful to do this. He says, you have to be sure to do this. Make sure, don't forget to do this. Because what's going to happen is this remembrance is going to result in their capacity to actually go in and take the land. And in verse 2, he tells them they should remember the whole way that the Lord their God had led them, that he might humble them. I read a story the other day. Apparently a young man had chosen to become a monk. Okay, and he entered into this monastic order that required a vow of complete silence. You've heard of these probably before, right? Vow of silence. And the monastery that he joined, they had one exception to this vow that he could do. And it was those who entered the monastery were permitted to speak only 2 words whenever they were called up to their meeting with the head of the monastery. Whenever that was, they could speak 2 words. So after 10 years, the head of the order calls this monk in and for an interview, and he says, how are you feeling? How are you feeling about these last 10 years, brother? He asked, and the monk replied with his 2 words, bad food. With this, the head of the order dismissed him, returned to his duties. 10 more years pass, and the same thing. He calls him in, head of the monastery, calls the monk to him, and he asks, so how are you feeling things now? It's been 20 years. How are things going? The monk replied with his 2 words, hard bed. Okay, he heard these words. The head of the order dismissed him to resume his duties, and 10 more years pass. The head of the monastery calls the monk and says, tell me, brother, how are you feeling about these things? How are you feeling about the monastery now? And the monk hands him his frock, takes off his sandals, hands it to him, and he says, I quit. And he walks out, and the head of the monastery goes, well, you know what? I'm not surprised at all. All you've done is complain these last 30 years. That's all you've done. Yeah, complaining. We like to complain. The Israelites complained. For 40 years, they've been complaining, this whole thing. And what we're seeing here is this has been a test. God is telling them this has been a test to humble them and to see if they would follow and trust the Lord or not. I love what Selena said this morning during the prayer time, because a lot of times we look at things as, oh, well, this is God's doing this to me, or, this idea, this happening in the world or this happening in my life must mean God hates me, or there is no God, or anything like that. And a lot of times, God is bringing us through things to test us. And it's a hard truth sometimes to think about, that God would test us. But he does. He tests the Israelites. He tells them it wasn't very long, and when they got into the wilderness, that they complained to God and to Moses that they were hungry. And what did God do? He provided manna for them. It appeared every day, right? Like they would go out and there would be manna, and they would collect enough for the day, and then on the day before the Sabbath, they would collect enough for 2 days and then take the Sabbath off. That was what they were supposed to do. And every day God would make manna appear for 40 years. Think about that. Something miraculous happening every day for 40 years. They had a vivid reminder of God taking care of them. And he tells them, he says, your clothes didn't even wear out. Miraculously, at 40 years, your feet didn't hurt. Like they didn't swell up. I took care of you when you were out there. Miraculously. And Moses tells them all these things, that you were in the wilderness and I took care of you. All of these things are so that you remember how God led you. And based on that guide, based on remembering how God led you, you can follow his guidance through his commands. Not just through him actually leading you, but how he wants to lead you in your life. How he wants to lead you in the way that you live, to walk in his ways, not just to walk in what he provides for you, but to walk in his ways. His guidance was designed to lead them into more and more faith through the keeping of his commandments. And in our own lives, you can probably look back at the way God has led you. You can probably look back at choices that you've made, whether good, whether bad. Those of us who are Christians, we know that God works everything for good for those who love him, right? We know that God works out things for our good. Those of us who've lived a little longer, who've had a little bit more life, you can see moments where God had been testing you. Maybe you were hungry, but he provided manna, just enough, right? Maybe you were wandering in the wilderness, but your clothes didn't wear out. Your feet didn't fail, right? You might have been in the wilderness struggling. Why am I out here? But you're being taken care of in the same instance. You can look back. A lot of us as Christians, we can look back at those times and say, man, that was a tough time in my life. But I can see God taking care of me, him leading me through this wilderness, through this tough time. Think back to all those times. It was so that you would trust him more. It was so that when he led you to the real place he's taking you, the promised land, you'd have your experiences to look back on and remember that it was him who guided you. It was him who led you. It was him who taught you. You can't live on bread alone. You need the word of God. Which brings us to the next thing, is to remember God's provision in our life. Verse 7, we're going to read it and then we'll talk about it. He continues, for the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and springs flowing out in the valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, a land in which you will eat bread without scarcity, in which you will lack nothing, a land whose stones are iron, out of whose hills you can dig copper. Verse 10, and you shall eat and be full, and you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. God led them, and he was going to provide. He provided for them when they journeyed, and he's taking them into a place where they're going to have an abundance. And as we remember God's provision, we should cultivate gratitude for God's provision in our lives. The Israelites would experience prosperity in the promised land. And they were to then, as a result, bless the Lord for what he had given them. You know, we usually pray before we eat, right? Here he's telling them, you're going to eat, and then you're going to thank me for all that you've eaten. You're going to pray after you eat. You're going to bless me after you eat. To bless the Lord. You know, we say things like bless the food, or, you know, can you bless you, right? Whenever somebody sneezes, or can you bless this? Priests and other Christian traditions like, you know, Catholicism and some other traditions, they bless homes and they bless things, and, you know, but to bless the Lord is a different idea, right? When we bless the Lord, it means to worship the Lord. It means to thank the Lord. It's acknowledging that God is truly the provider of all things, all good things, not only our daily needs, but when he gives us more than we need. It's very good to enjoy the things that God has given you, the way he's blessed you. If you're enjoying prosperity in your life right now, thank him. Remember him. Give glory to him. They're going to have an abundance here in this passage. They're going to this land where Moses said they're not going to lack anything. And part of remembering is cultivating a thankful spirit, right? Memorial Day. We're not just remembering people who sacrificed for us, but we're thankful that they did. There's this idea of gratitude of, man, I cannot believe that someone would do that for us. Someone would give their life in a way for people they don't even know, right? There's an idea of gratitude there. That remembrance leads us to be thankful for what's been given to us, for the sacrifices that others have made. You know, cultivating thankfulness in our lives should lead to worship of the Lord who provides everything for us. So, you know, maybe you're right now, you're not in the wilderness. Maybe you're on the other side of it, right? You're like, man, I've been through the wilderness, and now I'm kind of experiencing, like, my life is not bad right now. It's good. Amazing. Bless the Lord. Remember where God had led you before. Because now that you're in prosperity, it leads to the next thing, which is very, very important. The Hebrews were to remember God's power. Remember God's power. Here's what's going to happen if they forget. He's going to tell them, he says, remember, you're going to be in the land of prosperity. Remember, verse 11, take care lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments and his rules and his statutes, which I command you today. Lest when you've eaten and you're full and you've built good houses and you live in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiply and your silver and gold is multiplied and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart be lifted up and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrifying wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty ground where there was no water, who brought you water out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and test you to do good in the end. Beware lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, that he may confirm his covenant that he swore to your fathers, that is this day. And if you forget, here's the result. If you forget the Lord your God and you go after other gods and you serve them and you worship them, I solemnly warn you today that you shall surely perish. Like the nations that the Lord makes to perish before you, so you shall perish, because you wouldn't obey the voice of the Lord your God. Did you know that there's danger when you're in the land of plenty? When God actually gives you prosperity, When God gives you the things that you ask for and you're living a good life, there's danger there. There's danger there. Moses tells them what the danger is. Lest you forget the Lord your God. And here's what happens as a result of forgetting. The symptom of forgetting where the Lord has brought you is that you don't keep his commands and you don't keep his statutes. That's how he knows you forgot. It's whenever we disobey him. It's whenever the Israelites turned to other gods. That's how he knew they forgot, because they started disobeying his commands. Forgetting the Lord leads to abandoning his ways. It leads to action in our life. It leads to saying in your heart, like verse 17, my power got me here. The might of my hand is the one that has gotten me all of this. You know, we love to be recognized. Even those of us who are humble. You like how I said that? Those of us who are humble. Even those who are humble, if they're shy, people like that, people like to be recognized for things that they've done, for successes they have, promotions, awards, things like that. In America, we value hard work. In the West, we do. We value overcoming struggles and being scrappy and beating the odds. And we can get very focused on ourselves in these instances. I did this. This was my doing. This was my hard work. I earned this. It wasn't given to me. I worked hard for this, not like all those other lazy people who are just given whatever they are given stuff, but I worked for what I have. A lot of graduations happening right now, right? And students should be proud of what they've accomplished when they graduate, I think. But the reality is, was it really only them? Right? We can look at that. Was there no one who helped them get to where they are? Teachers, maybe? Coaches, parents, the schools that they went to, the opportunities that they were given. You think about the student maybe who gets into a prestigious college, right? Somebody who goes to a prestigious school. Well, the high school they went to happened to offer the classes that they needed to be able to get into this school, to get the credits that they needed, right? And they offered the extracurriculars that they needed that looked good on the college application to be able to get in to the school. And the only reason they went to that school is because their parents had a good job and their parents were able to provide for them and could live in the better neighborhood, right? Like you think about all these things that lead to our successes in life, right? You were able to do all the extra work because you had time, maybe, because guess what? I didn't have to work, right? I didn't have to work a 20, 30, 40-hour a week job as a teenager because my parents could provide for me. So I didn't have to work that much. I was able to actually do my homework. I was able actually to do all the extra credit work that got me into the school, right? So there's even more being given to you. Your parents worked to provide a home and an environment that you could be successful in. There are so many ways to look back at our lives and realize that we have been given a lot. Well, yeah, it was just my hard work. Well, there's no discounting what we do, but remember God's power. Remember, he is the one that is providing. He is the one that's giving you opportunities. He's the one giving you skills and talents. He's the one putting you in a place where you can succeed. He's the one that's giving you prosperity. And he says, if you just think that you did this on your own, that I had nothing to do with this, there's a curse. You will lose it. And guess what? The Israelites, they lose it. Big time. They do perish, right? Over and over and over again. God provides for them, and they follow him for a little bit, and then they forget, and they follow other gods, and they will perish. And eventually they perish like a lot. Like they perish like in little ways. Their whole country does, their whole nation. And then at some point, God exiles almost all of them and says, that's it. Temples destroyed. They're exiled to Babylon. For us as Christians, it's important to remember that even the work ethic, the skills, the talents that you have, are those not given by God? The intellect you may have, is that not given by him? Is not he the one who has given you what you need to be successful? We must remember him. And as Christians, one thing for us to remember, and it's not here in Deuteronomy 8, it's later in the New Testament, is to remember where you came from. Romans 6, 17 through 19 tells us, but thanks be to God that you who were once slaves of sin have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you were committed, and having been set free from sin." That's a passive thing, by the way. You had to be set free. You did not free yourself. You had to be set free. "You have become slaves of righteousness. I am speaking in human terms because of your natural limitations. How funny is that? Like, how would that be to you? I'm speaking in terms that you can understand. That's what Paul's saying here, because of your limitations. "For just as you once presented your members as slaves to impurity and to lawlessness, leading to more lawlessness, so now present your members as slaves to righteousness, leading to sanctification." Ephesians 2 tells us, "You were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived." That's all of us, by the way. We all once lived in that. "In the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, which were by nature children of wrath, like the rest of mankind." It's easy to forget where we came from. We can be so far removed as Christians, I think, from those times that were before. I had a friend in college who would say it was BC, before Christ. He was like, that was BC. All that stuff that happened, that was BC, before Christ. We can forget the state that we were in. He says, you were a slave to sin. You were dead in sin. We had to be made alive. We had to be made set free. All of this remembering is really about humility. It's about being humble. God himself is the beginning and the end of all of it. He provides, he leads, he empowers, and he saves. And we are not able to lead ourselves. We are not able to provide for ourselves. We are not able to save ourselves. Is a slave able to set himself free? If you're in bondage, you need someone to free you. Are the dead able to make themselves alive? You have to be made alive. The Lord must make us alive. He must breathe life into us and give his spirit to us. Memorials, remembering, being thankful. It's all about humility, reminding ourselves, man, everything I have, I owe to God. Everything, even the things that I accomplish, that's God still. He gave me the power. He gave me the skills. He gave me the intellect. And all he wants in return is for us to love him, to follow him, which is for our own good, by the way. It's not something that's not for us, not good for us. He wants us to follow him, and it is good for us to follow him. But it's a choice. It's a choice to remember. It was a choice for them, and it is a choice for us today. Last week, I talked about our default to want the easy way, to make our own decisions. Another default we have is to forget or to have selective memory, which I've been accused of, many times, to have selective memory. To not be grateful for what God has done for us. Remembering is something that someone can learn to do. They can train themselves to remember. We can remember the Lord by reading our Bibles, by chatting with each other and fellowshipping with other Christians, and by praying and by listening to podcasts. And I mean, there is no lack of Christian content out there that we can use to help us remember the Lord. There's no lack of it, right? You probably have 10 Bibles in your house, right? You got 100 different translations on your phone to read. There's no lack. There's no reason for us to forget. It's a choice to remember. And I think remembering helps us to develop spiritual sensitivities, seeing things, remembering the Lord. It's like we can subject ourselves to remember the miraculous that God has done, and then brace yourself for what happens after that, for the supernatural result. So 3 things I want to walk away from. Okay, I want you to take away from this as we remember the Lord your God. First is to remember what the hard times are for. They are meant to humble us. They are meant to train us to trust him so that we can really enjoy his blessings. Think about what they went through. They should have been, by the time they made it into the promised land, they should have been able to look back at those trying times, and that could have been, a fire to help them remember, where I've came from. A lot of us do that. We look back at our hard times, and that helps us to be thankful for our good times, right? We look back at the bad times, and that gives us encouragement for when it's good, but not for them. They forgot. God allowed the Israelites to go hungry so that they would learn to follow his leading. If we allow him to humble us and to draw us to himself, he will break us of our self-sufficiency. He wants to break us of our self-sufficiency, of thinking that you can do it all. You have control. You can get out of this. He wants to break us of that so that we can depend on him. Second, remember where your blessings have come from. It's the saying, count your blessings. Everybody says that, right? Oh, count your blessings. I think it's said so often because we should do it. We really should do it. Cultivating gratitude is so important in our lives. Cultivating gratitude. Even if you gain your success from your strength, your intellect, your effort, it is God that gives you that strength. It is God that gives you that intellect. It is God that gives you the ability to work. I always think about when Moses is saying, I can't do it. I have a speech problem. I can't talk. And he goes, who made the mouth? Who made your mouth? He says, did you forget who made you? Who actually gives you the ability to speak? We're always totally dependent on him. What do you have that you ultimately did not receive from him? Nothing. We have nothing that we didn't ultimately receive from the Lord. Nothing. And finally, remember, this is a hard one, that the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away, doesn't he? If we continue to ignore the Lord and our successes, he can take and will take our prosperity away. God isn't being harsh, he says. He says, like a father disciplines his son, so the Lord disciplines his people. That's what Moses says in Deuteronomy. He says, it's not because God is being mean, or because God is harsh, or because he's evil, or because he's not powerful enough. It's for our good that sometimes these consequences come from us forgetting the Lord. It's for our good so that we come back to him, so that we're drawn back to him. Psalm 77 is a great psalm, and we're going to end by reading this psalm today. It's a community lament, okay, when you read Psalm 77. It was written, I don't know if you know what a lament is, but a lament, I don't know if you read the book of Lamentations, but to lament something is to kind of like throw your hands up in the air, to express grief, to express sadness, okay? And this psalm was written for when the people of God were in a very low condition, okay? It acknowledges that, yeah, sometimes God leads us into things. Like, you think about Job, right? Like God led a righteous man into tough times, but I won't say most of the time, but a lot of the time, guess who causes the tough times in our lives? Yes, me. I am the one that causes the tough times in my life most of the time. It is my choices that lead us there. And in this psalm, the key words, I'm going to have them highlighted, but the key words I want you to think about are the term remember and the term meditate. Okay? If you're in a place right now where maybe you need to remember the goodness of God, this is a great psalm to read. It's a lament. It's meant to be a place where you are in a low condition. You read this so that you may be encouraged. The nation of Israel needed to be encouraged a lot. The psalmist, he begins with hopelessness. Like he begins in this hopeless place, but it seems like he intentionally decides to remember the goodness of God. He makes a decision to do it, to remember the miracles of the past, to give him hope for the future. So on this Memorial Day Sunday, remember the things the Lord has done. And we're going to read this and then we'll close it out. Psalm 77, entitled, if you're looking at your Bible, it's probably entitled something like, "In the day of trouble, I seek the Lord. I cry aloud to God, and he will hear me. In the day of my trouble, I seek the Lord. In the night, my hand is stretched out without wearying. My soul refuses to be comforted. When I remember God, I moan. When I meditate, my spirit faints. You hold my eyelids open. I am so troubled that I cannot speak. I consider the days of old, the years long ago. I said, let me remember my song in the night. Let me meditate in my heart. That idea of let me, he's telling himself, I need to remember. I'm going to choose to remember. Then my spirit made a diligent search. Will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? Has his steadfast love forever ceased? Are his promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in his anger shut up his compassion? Then I said, I will appeal to the years of the right hand of the Most High. What does he say there? He's saying, I'm going to remember what God has done. All those questions that I have about God abandoning me, I'm going to appeal to what has happened. I'm going to look back at to what has happened in this time. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your wonders of old. I will ponder all your work and meditate on your mighty deeds. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? You are the God who works wonders. You have made known your might among the peoples. You with your arm redeemed your people, the children of Jacob and Joseph. When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled. The clouds poured out water. The skies gave forth thunder. Your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lighted up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. It's with gratitude that prompted an old man to visit an old broken pier on the eastern seacoast of Florida. Every Friday night, until his death in 1973, it's written, he would return to this beach and he would walk slowly and slightly stooped among the beach with a bucket of shrimp. Okay? And the seagulls would flock to this old man and it would lead them, and he would feed them from his bucket. Many years before, in October 1942, this man, Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, was on a mission in a B-17 to deliver an important message to General Douglas MacArthur. You might know that name, right? There was an unexpected detour which hurled the captain into an adventure, to say the least. Somewhere over the South Pacific, he became lost beyond the reach of radio. Fuel ran dangerously low, so the men that were with him, they ditched the plane in the ocean, and for a month, Captain Eddie and his companions would fight the water, fight the weather, fight the sun. They spent many sleepless nights recoiling as waves, rammed their rafts. The largest raft was 9 by 5 that they had. But all of their enemies, out of all of their enemies at sea, one proved the most formidable, and it was hunger, right? Starvation. 8 days out, their rations were long gone. They were destroyed by the salt water. It would take a miracle to sustain them, and a miracle did occur. In his own words, another pilot that was with him, Captain William Cherry, he called him Cherry, here's what he wrote. He said, Cherry read the service that afternoon. We finished with a prayer and with a hymn. There was some talk, but it tapered off in the oppressive heat. And with my hat pulled down over my eyes to keep some of the glare out, I dozed off. Then I felt something land on my head. I knew that it was a seagull. He says, I don't know how I knew. I just knew. I felt it. Everyone else knew too, he wrote. He said, no one said a word, but peering out from under my hat brim without moving my head, I could see the expression on their faces. They were staring at that gull, and that gull meant food. If I could catch it. And the rest, as they say, is history. He caught the gull, the story goes. It says he caught it. He was able to catch it. They ate its flesh. I mean, they had nothing else to eat. They used its intestines as bait, and they were able to catch more fish. And the survivors were sustained, and their hope were renewed by a seagull, one seagull, uncharacteristically hundreds of miles from land. but it offered itself as a sacrifice unknowingly to these men. And he never forgot. He was eventually rescued. And every Friday evening, it said that at sunset on this Florida seacoast, you could see him walking, white-haired, bushy-eyebrowed, slightly bent over, his bucket filled with shrimp to feed the gulls. To remember the one, right? He did it as a gesture for the rest of the seagull's family on a long day that gave itself without a struggle, like manna, right? Like manna in the wilderness. So remember the Lord your God. Let's pray.